afternoon. My name is Cindy Arnson, Director of the Latin American Program here at the Wilson Center, and I am delighted to welcome so many colleagues and friends of Chile to this afternoon session with the Chilean Minister of Foreign Affairs, Roberto Ampuero. I would especially like to warmly recognize and welcome Patricio Diaz. I don't see Patricio right now, but Patricio, there we go, from the Embassy of Chile, Juan Aníbal Barilla, Chile's ambassador to the Organization of American States, Ambassador Carlos Pareja, Peru's ambassador to the United States, Alejandro Wolf, former U.S. ambassador to Chile, Arturo Valenzuela, dear friend, member of our advisory board, and as we all know, former Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and of course, Jorge Jaime, who is with us now as a public policy fellow and served as Chile's ambassador to China for many years. Chile has a well-deserved reputation in the Western Hemisphere and beyond for the strength of its democratic institutions, the vibrancy of its political debate, the quality of social inclusion, and the catalytic role that it has played in creating and sustaining an open, liberal trading order. These principles have endured with incredible continuity over many changes of government since Chile's transition to democracy in 1990. Chile is also an original member of the so-called P4, Pacific Four group of nations in Latin America and Asia, to have signed an agreement in 2005 that served as the basis for the subsequent Trans-Pacific Partnership. And when the United States withdrew from the TPP in January of 2017, Chile played a catalytic role in marshaling the remaining 11 countries to sign a final TPP agreement in Santiago scarcely 2 months ago. Chile appears now on track to grow something like 3.8% this year, a rate that is well above the Latin American average. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention the country's historic commitment to the creation of vast land and marine protected areas, which stand as an example for Latin America and indeed for the rest of the world. So it's in that context of Chilean leadership and persistent commitment to democratic principles that I'm delighted to introduce Foreign Minister Ampuero. Minister Ampuero was appointed by President Sebastián Piñera as Chile's Minister of Foreign Affairs in January of 2018. During the first Piñera administration, Mr. Ampuero served as Chile's ambassador to Mexico and subsequently as Minister to the National Council for Culture and Arts. And like another regional figure who we know well, who has combined a literary career with politics, Mario Vargas Llosa, Minister Ampuero is a distinguished novelist. He is the author of more than 15 novels, memoirs, and books on political affairs, and his literary works have been translated into German, French, English, and Chinese. He holds both a master's and a PhD from the University of Iowa and also completed postgraduate studies in literature, economics, and politics at the University of Humboldt in Berlin. Minister Ampuero was recently a fellow in the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. So thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. Dear Cynthia, thank you very much for this invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by expressing my joy at being in Washington, D.C., capital of this great country that has been my home for 18 years, where I developed a good part of my professional career as a professor and writer, and where I arrived with my family as an immigrant for my graduate studies. This country opened its doors to me, just as it has to millions of other people who, at some point, embraced its coasts in pursuit of opportunities, democracy, tolerance, and freedom. It is a great honor to be at the Wilson Center, which this year celebrates half a century, as a living testimony of former President Woodrow Wilson, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and inspiration for the League of Nations. At this presentation, I would like to express some reflections on democracy, freedom, liberty, human rights, and free trade, as well as Chilean foreign policy for the next 4 years of the second administration of President Sebastián Piñera. Perhaps one of the main characteristics of the Chilean foreign policy is that it's conceived as a, we call, state policy, política de Estado, based on a broad consensus about what national interest means for us. The pillar of continuity is rooted in our diplomatic tradition and institutional order. Upon the inauguration of each new government in Chile, it is understood that nobody is seeking to design an absolutely new foreign policy structure, but rather to add a new floor to this building. They are the great backdrop on which our endeavors unfold, which allow us to work towards medium and long-term goals and respond to challenges in matters of peace and international security, strengthen neighborly relations, as well as deliver the best conditions possible to develop and promote democratic values and developments. The cornerstone of our foreign policy is full respect for international law, which includes defending the validity of treaties, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and respect for national sovereignty. Chile is a reliable partner, primarily because it honors its pledges permanently and only hopes for the same from our counterparts. I assure you, without hesitation, that the large majority of Chilean diplomats who have passed through this forum have begun their speeches highlighting these same fundamentals. Probably continuity might be boring, but it gives us consistency. The second principle is the promotion of peace, democracy, and respect for human rights. Due to our experience between 1970 and 1990, to which I could add my own personal history living under left-wing and right-wing dictatorships, in Chile we have an absolute commitment to democracy and democratic values. I would say that we as a society have learned the lesson and the dangers of polarization, intolerance, and no dialogue, civic dialogue. There are no good dictatorships. I want to stress that democracy can't be compared in terms of results with authoritarian regimes. With regards to political participation, progress, and degrees of freedom, democracy has clearly demonstrated both superiority and flexibility, and also an ability to deal with social demands. On this point, allow me to make a brief reflection on the threat of populism. In my opinion, the most dangerous threat to democracy in our region, populism, with a democratic face, but authoritarian in its essence. Or, as Mario Vargas Llosa says, a disease against which no democracy is vaccinated, that wears the mask of the right and left, sacrificing the future for a transitory present. It is interesting to note that populists never refer to themselves as such. In democracy, populists are truly free riders. They hoist attractive proposals for an indeterminate mass, describe complex problems in a simple manner, and claim to have magical solutions. For those who believe in liberal democracy and freedom, the best available instrument to combat populism is the design of public policies and being able to defeat also this, the populism in the area of the political ideas. Public policies as tools aimed to increase the well-being of the greatest number of people. However, we know that our responses are temporary and at some point will require adjustments. To quote Karl Popper, here there is also a search without end, because not only do we not have all the answers, but also because the ones we do have are temporary and need constant revision. We enforce these two principles, defense of democracy and freedom and promotion of human rights, including with regards to brother countries in the region whose democracies are at risk and that find themselves on the brink of a humanitarian crisis. In that sense, we will not hesitate to state that the Venezuela crisis must be resolved democratically and peacefully, and the solution must come from the Venezuelans themselves, with the international community sharing the responsibility to cooperate in their solution. The Venezuelan regime should listen to the Venezuelans, to the Venezuelan people, and the international community. The government is responsible for the tragedy they are facing these days, a tragedy with a serious hemispheric impact. For that reason, next Monday, the Lima Group will meet in Mexico City, where Chile will be present alongside several partner countries from the region, urging the Venezuelan government to listen to its people and offer democratic, free, and fair elections. We Chileans do not forget that Venezuela was the home of thousands of our citizens following the coup d'etat in 1973, and for that reason today we are home to more than 170,000 Venezuelans who have arrived in recent years in Chile. I believe that the primary lesson is that the liberal or the Western democracy must duly cared for. Failing that, just as with many things in life, we will appreciate its true importance the moment we lose it. Just as the British historian Ferguson reminds us, so much of liberalism in its classical sense is taken for granted in the West today and even disrespected. We take freedom for granted, and because of this, we don't understand how incredibly vulnerable it is. The third principle of our foreign policy is the willingness to cooperate with other nations. We also say that it is a duty, not just our will. And this holds true for a variety of reasons. Firstly, because Chile was a recipient of cooperation funds that financed important programs for our path towards development. In this context, I would like to report that the OECD decided a few months ago to graduate Chile and remove it from the official development assistance eligibility list due to the income level we have achieved, which will eventually require us to redefine our cooperation policy. To these three great guidelines, we have added our firm conviction to bring closer the common citizen to diplomacy and foreign policy issues. Perhaps much more than in the United States, in our region, citizens feel that diplomacy is a subject more linked to cocktail perceptions than to real life and everyday people's problems. This is due to the fact that Latin America is probably the region where more treaties and agreements about integration have been signed, that have filled thousands of pages and that surely remain on the shelves of foreign ministries, but that have generated few advances in concrete terms. The ideological chasm in Latin America has become an important hurdle that in some cases has not only hampered the integration process, but paralyzed it, as it is the case of UNASUR. For this reason, half of its 12 members, including Chile, decided to halt their participation and suspended their financial contributions because UNASUR was simply not delivering in any substantive way its duties. In the case of Chile, we took such a decision based on our search for responsible management of both public resources and our support for an efficient multilateralism. We will continue advancing our goals for a better quality integration in fine coordination with other countries of the region, mainly because we forge our foreign policy from our Latin American cultural identity, and this is how Chile presents itself to the international community. In this regard, I can tell you that a few days ago, President Piñera concluded his first official visit to Argentina and Brazil, two countries with which we share an auspicious and sometimes conflictive moments marked by profound coincidences regarding global and regional themes. President Piñera also visited Peru on the occasion of the Summit of the Americas, and he had his first meeting with the recently inaugurated President Martín Vizcarra. After the International Court of Justice decision on the maritime border in 2014, with Peru, we have inaugurated a new era in bilateral relations characterized by a vision of future. Regarding our neighbor, Bolivia, I just want to highlight, beyond the decision of the International Court of The Hague, that we believe the court will recognize the solid arguments put forth by our country. We hope to continue advancing in the necessary integration that must be carried out openly, but also fulfilling the commitments both countries agreed, in particular, the Treaty of 1904, a cornerstone of the bilateral relation with Bolivia that brings stability, security, and peace to both countries. The dynamic and evolving international scenario claims for a foreign policy to be designed and implemented on both continuity and change. That is why we are introducing some adjustments to our foreign policy, continuity and change, to better align our principles with the outcomes we would like to achieve. Allow me to mention only some of them. Firstly, we are devising a foreign policy that is somehow decoupled from political contingency, a foreign policy with a more visible perspective aimed at anticipating risks while seizing opportunities. From this perspective, we have decided to center our efforts on achieving a more long-term view in issues that generally don't form part of the day-to-day work in foreign ministries, but towards where we want to concentrate with a vision of full coordination with the private sector, academia, and civil society as a whole. In this context, let me give you one example of this approach. Chile's border runs more than 2,600 miles throughout continental Chile, similar to the distance between New York and San Francisco, and makes the country a gigantic deposit of abundant reserves of fresh water, forests, mineral resources, climate systems, and ecological relations that include vast southern maritime spaces and millions of square miles of Antarctic territory. In this geographic inventory, despite of the long distance from the global centers of the power, Chile becomes a strategic actor beyond its borders. On this dynamic and uncertain global stage, the future of free trade is by far one of the most relevant topics. From a philosophical and political perspective, if you will, rather than merely an economic one, the free trade of goods, services, and investments expanded and gained legitimacy in tandem with democratic ideas. This evolving process shows us that truly free societies evolve towards freedom from an integrated approach in equilibrium, bringing together political, economic, social freedoms. Having said that, today free trade is facing challenges and critiques that we must deal with. The main criticism comes from countries that champion free trade, and it is based in that the benefits of open markets have primarily favored the elite. These negative trade complaints, whose escalation may lead to a trade war, is a concern for us as a country. As Jane Harman, CEO of this center, has recently asserted, trade war is totally unnecessary. It brings a big deal of uncertainty to the global markets with consequences that rapidly streamline in both governments and market operators. We have also recently learned about the letter signed up by more than 1,100 economists warning the US government about his raise the tariff approach to trade. It is interesting to note that many of the passages of this letter are quoted from another letter sent in 1930, preventing against protectionist measures the US imposed at the start of the Great Depression. This shift may generate political dividends in the short term, but in the long term does not contribute to the generation of wealth, affects the efficiency and the distribution of resources, hurts the job market, and generates pernicious incentives that in the long run do not contribute to the overcoming of poverty. Currently, Chile is one of the most open economies in the world. It has 26 trade agreements with 64 economies, which represent 63% of the world population and are responsible for 86% of world GDP. This policy has guaranteed greater certainty for trade and the flow of investment, boosting commercial exchange. With our main trade partners, China and the United States, our exports have multiplied in the last 12 years. I would like to stress that during this decade, China became our first commercial partner. USA now is the second after decades of clear predominance. In trade issues, we will certainly continue strengthening the successful integration mechanism of the Pacific Alliance that now has more than 60 observers and will soon include 4 new powerful associated states: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Singapore. In this area, we will continue the deepening of convergences of the alliance with Mercosur to advance in real Latin American integration, not the rhetorical one. The recent signing ceremony held in Chile of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, an ambitious and high-standard agreement alongside other 10 partners, signals our decisive commitment to trade liberalization, regional integration, inclusive growth, and job creation. We strongly believe that the CPTPP and the Pacific Alliance are key pathways to the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. And during our APEC host year in 2019, we will emphasize the work with that goal in mind. However, these efforts are not enough. We need collective and multilateral approaches. And allow me, ladies and gentlemen, just to finish, I would like to share some brief words about bilateral relations between Chile and the United States. Our countries maintain a historical relationship based on a long-standing friendship. Traditionally, we have shared visions about democracy, freedom, human rights, globalization, openness to business, characterized most often by a deep closeness and less commonly by distance and mistrust as a result of the collateral effects of the Cold War. Our commercial linkages have been historically intense. For Chile, the US was traditionally its primary trade partner. As I would like also to agree that the United States, although China is the most our most important partner, the United States is the most important investor in Chile, with a very with a portfolio of nearly $30 billion. We're convinced of the necessity to approve the bilateral agreement to avoid double taxation. It is our firm intention to continue strengthening what we already have, but also to expand the relations towards new cooperation mechanisms in education, scientific research, science, innovation, and energy cooperation. In this context, for us, it is highly relevant to expand the already successful existing experiences with Chile, California, and Chile, Massachusetts to other states and regions in this enormous country. We value Chile's successful participation in the visa waiver program as a milestone in our bilateral relations, and because of that, we are committed to continue implementing further agreements as we have done recently. In sum, continuity and changes mark the spirit of our approach to Chile's foreign policy. We are aware the international relation is an environment where if you want to go fast, you can go alone. But if you want to go far, then you have to come together with partners and allies based on affinities and conveniences. For Chile, a faraway country but one open to the world, it is fundamental to maintain a vision founded on the principle of cooperation between nations. As the illustrious President Wilson said, we are citizens of the world. The tragedy of our times is that we do not know this. Thank you very much.
In a moment, I'm going to open up the floor to take your questions and comments from the minister, but I'd like to start with a couple of my own. You mentioned the important principles on which U.S.-Chilean bilateral relations are based. I don't think I'm revealing any great secrets that you are coming to the Wilson Center having just met at the State Department with Secretary of State Pompeo. And I was wondering if you would be willing to characterize some of the themes that came up in that conversation and what the concrete agenda for Chile going forward vis-a-vis the United States might consist of.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Well, I had the meeting, but not with Secretary Pompeo. It was not possible for him since he had to attend other very important duties. You know already about that, and related to North Korea. And so we had today the meeting with Deputy Secretary of State Sullivan.
Mm-hmm.
And well, we were reviewing the level of the relation between both countries, and on economic terms, and also in cooperation and scientific terms, and investments as well. But the main focus during these days, of course, is the situation in some Latin American countries. Of course, in this case, Venezuela. United States, Chile, and the community in Latin America, but also the European Union, are all very concerned about the development in Venezuela. Chile thinks that Venezuela is in a tragedy, and in reality is facing a tragedy in economic terms, in political terms, and in humanitarian terms, and that the government of Venezuela is not offering real, transparent, free elections. And this is a way that it does not lead to anywhere. And this is a very serious situation currently in Latin America. We do not see, and I think that this is a shared vision with the United States, we do not see that there is an alternative, a clear alternative from the government of Venezuela to be able to go into a new level of development or a solution of the crisis, not even in political, not even in economic terms. So that is a concern. It's a concern for Chile, of course. How do we feel this crisis, this Venezuelan crisis? Well, we probably first I should stress that we support the groups and the parties and the politicians in Venezuela who demand democracy and freedom and a democratic system. And on the other side, we are feeling the impact of this crisis through the migration. So this is already an hemispheric crisis. Probably it will become worse. And the responsibility of the community, of the Latin American countries and the international community, is to look for alternatives that can assure or contribute with a peaceful change, a peaceful development, so that Venezuelans do not suffer this tragic situation anymore.
Great. Let me follow up on that a little bit, because I think without exception, everyone in this room looks for a peaceful and democratic solution to the crisis in Venezuela. How do you reconcile the principles of the defense of democracy and non-intervention? And specifically, you mentioned the upcoming meeting in Mexico of the Lima Group, which has already met several times and issued very strong statements about what's going on in Venezuela and the lack of path to free elections. Would Chile join countries of Europe, join the United States, join Panama in applying economic sanctions as a way of bringing about change? Or is it the view of the government of Chile that further economic sanctions hurt principally the Venezuelan people, less the government, the Venezuelan regime, and therefore that is not a path that the hemispheric community should pursue?
Yeah. First, I would like to stress that Chile is in constant dialogue and consultations with other countries in Latin America. So this is a process, it's a working process. That's why the meeting next 14th, well, very soon, Monday, is so important. The meeting between the ministers of foreign relations and the ministers of economy, or Hacienda, finance. We are, believe me, working very hard on this in a very responsible way. I agree with you. If you, as a community of states, or as an international community, plan to take some measures in terms of economic sanctions, you have to be very careful, because they will hurt, especially, as always happened, the Venezuelan people who are suffering a lot now. So if we see a kind of sanctions, they have to be very precise and not hurting the Venezuelan people, but probably showing the leadership of Venezuela that they do not have a free ride on this, and that they will be responsible for the development and the crisis in Venezuela. I agree with you. Some people may think that this is a kind of policy that should be avoided in terms of foreign countries talking about what should be done in Venezuela. And this is a very serious subject. We take it very cautiously. But I would like also to stress that there are no borders for human rights in terms of the defense of human rights. This is a philosophy we should keep in mind. But in practical terms, it's very important that the opposition in Venezuela shows a way for Venezuelans first, and also for the international community, that we can support. It's not about the group of Lima or Canada or United States or European Union showing the way for Venezuela, but the Venezuelans asking the international community for support for a project of developing of Venezuela and pursuing a democratic government, a democratic society. But it's very clear that the situation in Venezuela is becoming very serious, and the impact is already at the hemispheric level.
Thank you. You mentioned in your prepared remarks the process of convergence between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur. And the fact is that Chile has much more important economic relationships with two members of Mercosur, with Brazil and Argentina, than it does with the other members of the Pacific Alliance. I was wondering if you could address with any specificity what sorts of things would create that convergence, given the dramatic difference between those two economic blocs and the pattern of integration that they have pursued.
Probably the most important aspect in this is to understand that this is about the process, and but a responsible process, and that means several steps and a lot of patience. Although we can make some progress in some issues faster than in others, but at the end of the day, what is important here? It's important that Argentina and Brazil, who are very important in economic and political terms in our continent, in South America, in our region, have decided a political change, a different attitude in relation to free trade, in relation to integration to the world, in relation to integration of South America as such. And this is already a very important signal for all of us. Two very important countries have decided to start a game changer in this term, and we welcome Brazil and Argentina. Of course, there are a lot of issues we have to solve before, and Chile and Peru and Colombia and Mexico, we have to work on that, I think, in a very precise and concrete way. It will be about measures that have to be taken, and but I would stress, this is not something you solve just by a declaration of goodwill. This is a process, and that is what has started the process of approaching of both economic blocks. And I think that is a good path, especially in times where we have been listening to some protectionist voices around the world. That is for us very, very concerning, because all the development of Chile in the last 30, 40 years has been based on this policy of free trade and an open economy. And we plan to work on that in the future. We have reached very interesting results in terms of reducing poverty, and mainly it is based on, well, on public policies, of course, but also on this integration on the world. Remember, the population of Chile is 80 million inhabitants. The market is a small market. So our alternative, looking into the future, is based on being able to export and being able to develop our relations with the rest of the world.
Great. I'd like to turn to the questions now from those of you in the room. Before doing that, I'd like to recognize Anders Biel, my colleague in the Latin American program, who has been so helpful in putting this together. Also, our hardworking interns, Jamie Shank, Stephanie Heredia, who's in the back. Please state your name and affiliation as you ask a question. We'll take an open round of 2 and then turn it back to Minister Ampuero. Right here.
Thank you, Minister. A pleasure to be today with you here. My name is Maximiliano Bello. I work for the Pew Charitable Trust. I'm a principal officer there. As we've seen this last few years, even from the previous government of President Piñera, Chile has become a leader on conservation, marine conservation in particular, not just because of the marine protected areas, but also a leader in different discussions for the UN on BBNJ, illegal fishing around the world, climate change on the Paris Accord. How do you see the agenda on these issues for the next 4 years?
A real source of Chilean soft power, undoubtedly. Here, in the front, Sonia.
Thank you, Sonia Schott with Diario Las Américas. Ministro Ampuero, I was wondering if you can tell us what are the lessons that Latin America learned from the Cuban experience, not to repeat the same mistakes in Venezuela. And the second part is, my understanding is that President Piñera introduced a immigration law change recently, and I would like to know if you can elaborate a little bit more on that, since there are so many Venezuelans who just arrived in Chile before that, and they feel like they are in a kind of limbo. Thank you.
Take comments on those two.
Okay. Well, sorry, what's your name? Sonia. Okay. Okay. Thank you. First, regarding the question of Max, this is a very specific question. I know you are an expert on this field. I am not, but I have to tell you, and I would stress that I want to stress what I said during my presentation in terms of that we have a política de Estado regarding foreign policy. In this case, is part of the foreign policy, our attitude and our philosophy about in reality about conservation, sea conservation, and so I see that we are going to deepen those aspects we have been developing especially during the last government. There was a very interesting offensive, and there were the former government took some very interesting measures in terms of reserves and in the south of Chile especially, and regarding the sea, regarding parks, and we want to keep that path. That's for sure. I have to acknowledge that at the same time, when you develop this kind of policy, there is, on the other hand, a kind of reaction. People and circles and interests that think one or the country should not go so fast in certain directions. So what I assume there will be a kind of dialogue, or the dialogue will continue about this, but this is part of the development of democracy. There is no, you know, there are decisions you have to make, and there are a certain, it's very clear there are several groups and movements and parties and organizations that want to have a say in this, in the decisions you make. It was easier in past decades to make some decisions on this level, or it was probably in other countries, or probably also in Chile. It was not necessary to react because there was not a popular demand about that. But now we have a very empowered society, very empowered groups and organizations that demand their interests to be taken into account. And we are going to work based on a very close dialogue and regarding as well those interests and positions. So I don't see changes, big changes in that. I think more there will be a continuity in this. Cynthia talked about soft power. I agree with you. This is part of soft power of Chile. 2 days ago, we had a wonderful meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica, and we were talking specific about soft power. Costa Rica is another country who has a very specific soft power based on, well, on its historic development and also the relation with environment. And for me, it's important to look also into this dimension. How do we develop more soft power? A country with 80 million inhabitants needs not only good arguments, but also positions that can be supported by other countries, or that can show a kind of way of path for other countries. And so we are working on that. But the essential aspect in this is to be able to keep and develop a dialogue with the so-called civil society. And regarding the question of Sonia, did you ask me about the lessons we have we should about the okay. Well, I don't think that I believe that this history changed a lot, and it's very difficult to compare some political experiences. But there are some voices and analysts who think that Venezuela will become or is already is a second Cuba. But I would prefer to stay on Venezuela, saying that my government is concerned about the situation in Venezuela, and we want to help Venezuela to find a way out of this crisis. And at the same time, we want to, and we need, and we want to be responsible in terms that we really, truly contribute to the solution of this crisis. And on the other hand, that we show our willingness to receive migrants from Venezuela. I mentioned the number of Venezuelans who have arrived in Chile in the last years, 170,000, and as well people from Haiti. It's more than 125 last year. So this is a challenge for the country. It's if you add this number of citizens coming from other countries, just if you add only people coming from Haiti and from Venezuela, it is the number of people is I would say a large city in Chile for Chilean for Chile as such. It's over 300,000 people. It's a large city in Chile. So, and you know, it's not only about receiving people. We think there is a right you have to leave your country, but on the other hand, it's controversial if you have the right to arrive and to be received in a compulsory way by other countries. We think that when we offer the opportunity to Venezuelans or to people from other countries to live in our country, we have to offer as well the conditions to these people to have a life with dignity, that they can have also job places, that they can have a good housing. It's not only about receiving people. And that's why the government of President Sebastián Piñera decided to introduce some changes in immigration policy. In the case of Haiti, we put a process that allows us to get information in advance of Haitians who want to come to Chile. And this process starts in Haiti as such. And the Chilean consulates are the ones who have to receive the information of these citizens, and they have to tell us if they plan to go to Chile as tourists or if they want or plan to live in Chile forever or to stay in Chile and look for a job. This was a very important measure. It is supported by the majority of Chileans. We are an open country. We are a country who highly appreciates migration. We believe in the concept of diversity and tolerance. But on the other hand, we have to acknowledge as well that for a part of the Chilean population, this process needed a kind of order. The government was asked to control the borders in the proper way. To give you an example, in a few years, the number of people coming from other countries in Chile went up from 500,000 to 1.2 million. So it has a big change, and we want to ask and react with responsibility. This is related, I would say, to two concepts. The first one is the truth. If you come to Chile, please tell our officers at the border that you are coming as a tourist, and if you do so, you have to return to your country because you told us that you would visit Chile for 30 days, not to stay in the country. This is related to saying the truth. And the other aspect is dignity. We want that those people who come to Chile because they are looking for better life expectancies and life conditions, that they really find the possibility, the real possibility of having a better life. And in that direction we're working, and we are absolutely convinced that this is the right way to do so. Responsibility, solidarity, but responsibility. Migration, welcome with a responsibility. But I want to stress, Chile and the government of Chile is, we both receive, of course, migration with open arms, but it has to be in an ordered way. And we highly appreciate what we need as well, diversity in every sense, and as well what that Chile needs as well more immigrants. This is because of the demographic development of Chile. We urgently need more immigration. So there are some aspects and different interests that have to be balanced and organized in a certain direction, so that this experience become a positive experience for Chileans and people who are already living in Chile and were not born in Chile, and those who migrate or want or plan to go to Chile to live there.
We started a little late, so we'll continue just for two more questions, and then I think we'll have to close it off. Any other questions? This gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Robert Carlson. I'm with the Latin America Working Group. I had another question related to Venezuela. So it sounds like a lot of the focus is on ensuring that Venezuelans can return back to the country. Have you met with your counterparts to discuss durable solutions if they can't go back to the country in the immediate term?
You mean the Venezuelans?
Right.
Back
So-
to their country?
Right. So you've discussed how Chile has worked to ensure that the situation in Venezuela is improved, but if it can't be improved in the short term, are there attempts to ensure solutions for refugees if they can't go back home?
Why don't we end on that note?
Okay. Talking very frankly, we are in a first stage of receiving Venezuelans who escape from their country, who don't want to live in Venezuela, who are looking for better alternatives of life. And that is the stage in which we are. And the next step, if Venezuelans who arrive in Chile decide to live in Chile, stay in Chile, or they plan to go back, depends on the development in Venezuela. So I cannot anticipate that this development, the circumstances we are facing now in Venezuela demand responses in the first level, in the first stage. So we are not dealing now with this, allow me to say, hypothetical question of what will happen after Venezuela has or recovers democracy. No, we haven't worked on that. But I want to add something to this. Venezuelans have the so-called visa of democratic responsibility, the responsabilidad democrática. And that's why do Venezuelans get that visa? especially because during the time of the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, many Chileans found in Venezuela a second home, and they were escaping of Chile, as Venezuelans are escaping today from their country, and found a second home in Venezuela, and we are very grateful for that. And before the dictatorship of Pinochet, there were also many, or hundreds, if not probably 2,000 Chileans, I don't know exactly the number, who left Chile and went to Venezuela because they were looking for better perspectives of life. And Venezuela at that time was a land of prosperity, offered to all Latin Americans good alternatives of job and of life. And Chileans went to Venezuela and to live there. And since we have this history who brings us very close, as a government, the government of President Piñera decided to issue this special visa for Venezuelans in gratitude to what Venezuela, when it was democratic and very prosperous, showed and offered Chilean citizens who were looking for better alternatives.
Great. On that note of kindness, I would like to thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I wish you and your government much success, and that the United States-Chilean relationship would only prosper.
Thank you very much,
Please join me.
Cynthia.